Jora Stevens was more than a mother. She was the heartbeat of her family. A charming, warm, and witty lady who lit up every room she entered with her contagious laughter and unforgettable smile, she could brighten up even the darkest day. Jora wasn't loved. She was adored by everyone who knew her. But perhaps the most profound bond she shared was with her only child, Troy. Troy Stevens was the be-all and end-all of Jora's world growing up. Being an only child, he had no siblings to share the attention, so he was everything to her. Their relationship wasn't that of mother and son, but was a deep-rooted friendship built on the pedestal of mutual trust, humor, and unconditional love. Be it those baseball matches when she cheered loudly from the sidelines or quiet evenings in front of the television, Jora and Troy were inseparable. Troy often thought about how much of his childhood was daubed with colors of Jora's boundless affection. She had this way of turning even the grayest of moments into memory-building ones, baking cookies on rainy afternoons, singing loudly with her favorite songs in the car. Just about everything was special once Jora entered the equation. She taught Troy more than how to live. She taught him how to love, fiercely, unapologetically, and with his whole heart. Jora was the poster baseball mom, never missing one practice or game, always there to offer words of encouragement and a bright smile. Troy's father, Phil, coached the team, but Jora was the cement that held it all together. She brought in snacks for the players, rallied the other parents, and cheered the loudest when Troy stepped up to bat. Those were the golden years, full of laughter, happiness, and that feeling of being unbreakable. In the middle of those baseball afternoons, Jora would be surrounded by other parents, making even the most mundane conversations entertaining with her infectious humor. Her warmth was magnetic, drawing people to her with ease. She had an innate ability to make everyone feel seen and valued. For Troy, her unwavering presence wasn't just a source of pride, it was the foundation of his confidence. But life, as it often does, has a way of shattering even the most perfect of pictures. It was a warm evening in May 1987 when everything changed. Jora had spent the day shopping for a prom dress with a friend. They'd roamed store after store, laughing and debating over the perfect choice. Finally, they found it. As they pulled into Jora's driveway, the air was filled with the light-hearted chatter of satisfied shoppers. Jora stepped out of the car, her friend waving in a goodbye as she watched her walk to the back door. What happened next is a haunting mystery, a moment frozen in time. Jora disappeared into the house, reappearing briefly at the front door, waving one last goodbye. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Hours later, Troy came home from an evening out with friends. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was something odd about the atmosphere as he stepped through the doorway. His heart racing, he called out for his mother. No answer. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw her. Jora was lying on the kitchen floor, soaked in blood with her maroon house robe. Troy's world came apart in that instant. He dropped everything and rushed to her side, but it was too late. The scene was horrific, the violence unimaginable. Blood pooled around her, evidence of a brutal struggle. Shaking and overwhelmed, Troy stumbled back, grabbed the phone, and called for help. The police arrived in a very short time, but what they saw was from the worst dream. The kitchen was a mess, with everywhere traces of a furious fight. Pieces of a knife were lying on the floor, chilling evidence of the strength the knife had been used with. The blade snapped because of the extreme force used in the attack and later was identified as belonging to Jora's kitchen. Blood-smearing fingerprints streaked across the walls of Jora's futile attempt to break free from her assailant. She'd managed to get as far as the hallway to within arm's length of the front door. Within arm's length of freedom. The autopsy would later reveal the extent of the horrors committed. Jora had been stabbed almost 30 times. The cuts dotted her body, her neck slashed in a deep, gaping cut. This was no random act of violence. It was personal. The kind of rage required to inflict such injuries spoke of a deeply rooted anger, a vendetta. But who could hate Jora Stevens? a woman loved by so many. Immediately, investigators started focusing on those closest to her, as the murderer in such cases is usually someone the victim knew well. First among those questioned was Troy. His grief was raw, his shock palpable as he described the bond he shared with his mother, the memories of their last conversation, and his inability to believe that she was gone. Detectives quickly eliminated him as a suspect. His heartbreak was real, his alibi solid. The next in line was Janora's husband, Phil Stevens, who had gone on a fishing trip that night and returned early that morning. He received the news of his wife's murder with reactions of demanding answers from the police while lacking visible grief typical for a husband in mourning. Yet again, no hard evidence connected him with the crime, and the alibi of Phil panned out. Eventually, the case went cold. Months went by without any clues. The Stevens family couldn't let go, living their lives under the shadow of those unanswered questions about Janora's death. Then, one day, a casual encounter gave new life to the investigation. Two teen girls who sat in a parked car near the Stevens home the night of the murder came forward with a chilling story. They told about a man, disheveled and agitated. Wearing an oddly buttoned-up light blue jean jacket against this scorching summer heat, scratches just above the neckline of the sweater spoke of his fight. The account of the two teenage girls led investigators to Quentin Barnes. Quentin was a troubled teenager with petty crimes on his record. He was known to the local police for shoplifting and trespassing on several occasions. He did not have any known history of violence, but his proximity to the Stevens home and the suspicious behavior described by the girls made him a person of interest. At the time of the murder, Quentin had been staying next door with his sister, Victoria Barnes. Detectives obtained a search warrant for the property, hoping to find evidence that might tie him to the crime. Inside the cluttered apartment, they found it: a light blue jean jacket lying on the floor of a closet. It looked so routine initially, until forensic examination began to reveal that Janora's maroon robe had its fibers snagged on his jacket. Then there were blue fibers in Janora's fingernails from the jacket, in evidence of her fight for her life. However, the most damning evidence turned out to be a single thread of hair fastened within his jacket thread from Janora's head, dyed the exact shade as that of his. Evidence began to mount, and a case of sorts started to build against Quentin Barnes. Even after the detectives brought Quentin in for questioning, he still maintained his innocence in a hostile manner as the evidence mounted. His alibi was weak. Pressed, he began concocting an alibi and fingered his sister, Victoria. Quentin's claims against his sister just made it even more tragic. He said she had had a very heavy argument earlier that day with Janora. In his tale, Victoria had confronted Janora over some personal dispute and, in a fit of anger, drew a knife from the kitchen. But it didn't make sense. Victoria had no history of violence and no motive for such an act. But having an ironclad alibi with forensic evidence incapable of placing her at the crime scene, the interest shifted to Quentin, and the most damning was DNA analysis. Semen was found in Janora's throat. It matched Quentin's profile, a revelation that linked him inescapably to the crime and further layered on the savagery with which Janora had been subjected to. It was not a crime of opportunity or robbery gone sour. It was an act so cruel, unimaginable, and for no rhyme or reason whatsoever. The following trial was not an easy event to witness for the family of the Stevens. The members of the jury viewed graphic evidence showing just how brutal this crime was, including images of a blood-stained kitchen, pieces of a knife everywhere, and the severity of the assault. They heard forensic experts reconstruct events, each bit of information leaving a clearer picture of Janora's final moments. However, the forensic evidence and the discrepancies in Quentin's story, along with the testimony of the girls, told a damning case against him. Troy had been present in every session of the trial, now in his late teens, sitting stoically while the weight of his mother's loss was deeply etched into his face. Friends and neighbors testified to Janora's goodness, the positive impact she had on their lives, and the bond between mother and son that would never be broken. To Troy, every testimony cut deeper, the things that were taken from him, yet it further galvanized his determination to see justice served. The defense for Quentin tried to argue that evidence was circumstantial, that scratches on his neck and fibers under Janora's nails could have come from an innocent encounter. But the DNA evidence would not be denied. Finally, when the jury returned with a verdict of guilty, it was as if a weight had been lifted from the courtroom. Quentin Barnes received a sentence of life in prison without parole. The Stevens family felt that the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the void left by Janora could never be filled. Troy struggled with the finality of it all. The memories of his mother, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her embrace were now tinged with the cruel reality of her loss. He replayed so many times in his mind what happened that night, as if looking for the answers to those questions which are never to be told. For his part, Phil Stevens coped with the pain his own way. Cleared of suspicion in the beginning, it had been known that he was alienated from Janora several months prior to her passing, making a cloud loom over him in bereavement as well. Later on, he would move from there, too traumatized by lingering memories within their house's walls. Quentin Barnes was found dead in his jail cell just days after his sentencing. Authorities ruled it a suicide. He had overdosed on a stash of pills smuggled into the facility. News of his death brought mixed emotions. To some, it felt like a cruel twist in a story already steeped in tragedy. To others, it was a fitting end for a man who had caused so much pain. But to Troy, it left a chasm where answers might have been. When Quentin died, the full truth of what happened that night, the why, was taken with him. The questions haunted Troy for years and sculpted his journey in ways he could not quite understand. Though her death was cloaked in darkness, Janora's life continued to be an inspiration to those who knew her. To Troy, she was a guiding memory. He became a social worker, dedicating his life to helping families and their children through tough times. In every success, he felt his mother's presence, her lessons of resilience and compassion echoing in his actions. Janora's community also worked at keeping her memory alive. Friends and neighbors formed the Jora Stevens Memorial Fund, which funded projects around town promoting the prevention of violence and bringing people together in their community. There was even an annual memorial baseball game to remind people of the joy and love she had brought into so many lives. Jora Stevens was more than a victim. She was a beacon of love, a source of light in the lives of those who knew her. Her life was cut short by an act of unimaginable violence, but her memory endures. In the quiet moments when her laughter echoes in the heart of those she left behind, Janora remains a symbol of resilience, love, and the enduring strength of a mother's bond with her child. Her story is not merely one of tragedy, but also of profound impact. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of love. For Troy, Janora's unwavering support and boundless affection continue to shape his life, a testament to a bond that even death could not sever. While there's indeed another world living in the shadow of glittering Hollywood, a world where dreams come true, desperation and danger in the breaks of the sidewalk wait to pounce. South Central Los Angeles was among the battled communities to see its streets being strolled for decades by something out of a nightmare and one with a name: the Grim Sleeper. This darkness didn't just suddenly appear, it seeped in unseen, through alleys and vacant lots, where the bodies were discarded as if their lives had little meaning. It was a community already worn down by poverty and the scourge of crack cocaine that was now fighting an invisible foe, a predator right in their midst. The gleaming Hollywood Hills contrast with the struggles of South Central. Here, dreams weren't deferred. They were often extinguished cold. Families were fighting not only systemic neglect, but also a terrorizing reality that took away their security. This contrast of hope and despair forms the backdrop to the Grim Sleeper's story, the grim reminder of how unseen communities bear the brunt of indifference. It began with whispers, rumors of women disappearing. their bodies later found discarded like refuse. It was 1985, and the streets of South Central were already racked by the crack epidemic. The victims were women, many of them sex workers, struggling to survive in a world that seemed to offer no second chances. These were not mere statistics to the people of South Central. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. Every disappearance tore through the community, leaving scars that ran far deeper than the crime scenes. These were women whose lives were filled with resilience, making their way in a world that too often cast them aside. Their disappearances and tragic ends were personal losses that refused to heal as collective wounds. Henrietta Wright was the first. A mother of 5, she was found in an alleyway, her body callously discarded beneath a mattress. An autopsy showed she'd been raped and shot in the chest with a .25 caliber handgun. No witnesses, no shell casings, no leads, only questions that would reverberate unanswered for years. Henrietta's story paints a gut-wrenching picture. Her children, left to make sense of a loss they couldn't fathom, were left to carry the mantle of her love as the world seemed to keep moving. Each of her 5 children carried the weight of her absence, their grief compounded by a justice system that offered no answers. To outsiders, she became a case file, but to her family she was a quiet beacon of love whose light was snuffed out in the most cruel way. Henrietta's story was achingly familiar, a woman trying to hold her life together, stolen away in an instant. Her children were left with nothing but memories, their grief compounded by the silence of justice. To investigators, her murder was another in a growing list of violent crimes, but to those who loved her, it was a void that would never be filled. Each victim was like a thread in the tapestry of community pain. The injustice wasn't in the crime itself, but in the lack of urgency to resolve it. To a community already weathering the storm of systemic neglect, every unanswered question became a haunting reminder of their place in society, forgotten and ignored. It wasn't until the late 1980s that detectives began to see a chilling pattern. Yet another victim, Barbara Ware, was found similarly slain. A tipster had called 911, describing a van leaving the scene, but that trail went cold. Barbara Ware's life was reduced to a case number, as so many others have been. Behind that number was a dreamer, a lover, and a person who loved and was loved in return. Every stone left unturned in her investigation represented a failure not only of justice itself, but of something far greater valuing lives lived on the fringes. It was not just another puzzle waiting to be solved, it was a testimony to how the priorities of society shape and mold the concept of justice. Other murders, including those of Henrietta Wright and Barbara Ware, had been linked through ballistics. The same weapon was used in each killing, a .25 caliber pistol. But even at that, the case remained obscure, lost in a sea of crimes and systemic neglect. The science of ballistics connected these dots, but without the resources or will to follow through, the grim sleeper's shadow continued to spread. Each breakthrough that didn't lead to resolution deepened the wound for families left behind. For them, these connections weren't just data points, they were glimmers of hope that the system would finally take notice of their pain. The LAPD finally formed the Southside Slayer Task Force after a series of murders. However, it was seriously under-resourced. The majority black community of South Central were basically shouting into the wind as few listened. The task force was eventually dissolved without resolution, and many families still question if the lives of their loved ones were worth anything to those who were sworn to protect and serve them. The disbanding of the task force was a blow not only to the investigations but also to the faith of the community. To the families, it felt like an official acknowledgement that their grief wasn't worth the effort. It cemented the gap between those tasked with enforcing justice and the people they were supposed to serve. This abandonment only deepened the scars of mistrust and disillusionment. Anitria Washington would change everything. One fateful night, she encountered a man driving an orange Pinto. What began as a friendly conversation quickly turned sinister. I remember thinking, "Something's not right," she recounted years later. "I reached for the door handle and that's when he shot me, point blank in the chest. Everything went hazy as she struggled to stay conscious. The man raped her, took pictures of her, and left her to die." But Anitria wasn't done fighting, bleeding, and weak. She stumbled to her friend's house, leaving behind a trail of blood that spoke volumes of the unbroken will of a girl surviving. Anitria's survival wasn't just a testament to her strength, it was a lifeline to a community desperate for answers. Her bravery gave a face to the fight against the grim sleeper. She became a symbol of resilience and a stark reminder that to survive is to resist. Her story carried the weight of a community's determination to bring a shadowy predator to light. Anitria had survived, pure miracle style. Despite the injuries sustained, she provided a description of her attacker, a feat of courage that would soon prove invaluable. Her story shone light on the grim realities of being a woman in South Central, life as resistance. It was a call to action, her testimony, not for the police only, but also for a society too that had looked away too many times from the desperate stories of helpless women. Anitria's voice resonated within the walls of justice, seeking not merely accountability but acknowledgement of the humanity of every victim. For more than a decade, the killings stopped. The media and police moved on. But in South Central, a memory of fear lingered. It was then that the grim sleeper had gotten his name. Why did he stop? Guilt? Caution? Or a sense of invincibility? These were questions that would torment investigators long after his crimes resumed. The pause wasn't a reprieve for the community, it was a haunting silence. Each passing year brought uncertainty, a feeling that the monster could re-emerge at any moment. For families of the victims, the absence of closure meant time itself became another form of torment, stretching pain infinitely. Criminologists were left to speculate about the hiatus. Had Franklin's life circumstances changed? He simply stopped because he was afraid of being caught? The gap only deepened the mystery, allowing the grim sleeper to exist as a phantom, a shadow of violence that seemed to dissipate but never truly left. This hiatus was a sober reminder of how erratic evil can sometimes be. Franklin managed to cement his place in that society even better, as more years passed without incident, building a more effective smokescreen for himself. Of course, such a hiatus set him up more effectively for when he would strike once again, suddenly and with a depth that would blow on old wounds with renewed fury. In 2002, the grim sleeper struck again. Valerie McCorvey, a mother of two at 35 years old, was found strangled in an alley. She was different from the first victims because she did not have gunshot wounds. The killer had changed, but his signature cruelty did not. Then came the next, Princess Bartholomew, 15 years old. The community was again paralyzed by fear, but this time technology was on the side of justice. Princess's youth even sent shockwaves around the most hardened detectives. She was not just a victim, but a child full of promise, her life stolen before it really began. Her death galvanized the community and reignited demands for justice that could no longer be ignored. The community was taken in shock when Princess Bartholomew died. She wasn't just another victim, but a child, and the brutal murder depicted an ultimate violation of innocence. Her name turned into a battle cry to make sure that no more lives would be lost in the dark from neglect. By 2010, DNA advances had blown the case wide open. Detectives used a new technique called familial DNA testing to find relatives of unidentified suspects. One such hit came back, but not to the killer himself, but to his son. The trail led to Lonnie Franklin Jr., a former city sanitation worker living in the heart of South Central. His job, his unassuming demeanor, his friendly neighborhood presence, all masks for the horrors he concealed. Detectives pieced together his routine, noting how his work with sanitation gave him access to locations where victims were discarded. The banality of his life stood in stark contrast to the terror he inflicted, a reminder that evil often hides in plain sight. Under surveillance, Franklin lived his life as if nothing had changed. Detectives followed him to a pizza parlor where a discarded slice provided the evidence they needed. The revelation of Franklin's identity sent shockwaves through his community. How could someone so ordinary hide such extraordinary evil? It forced his neighbors to question everything: their trust, their instincts, the nature of the human beings that surrounded them. 3 days later, the call came. It was a match. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was the grim sleeper. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, leaving many neighbors, friends, and even relatives astounded. How could this very ordinary, to all appearances harmless man be capable of monstrous actions? To many, it was again that painful reminder that we really don't know much about those passing our way each day. It was a moment of reckoning when it sank in. The predator had lived among them, within the fabric of South Central, a presence trusted to this very day, who betrayed his victims as much as the community as a whole. This wasn't an arrest about justice alone. This was an arrest to restore security stolen over decades. The courtroom was full of tension as survivors and their victims' families confronted their perpetrator, who had taken so much from them. Anitria Washington stood tall, her voice unshaken, as she described what happened to her. She was not only testifying to facts, but showed an act of courage and resilience. In the courtroom, she became the voice of the voiceless and reminded one that even in unimaginable darkness, the human spirit could hold on. Her presence was one that gave hope to the families who still were in search of closure. In 2016, Franklin was convicted of 10 murders and the attempted murder of Anitria. The judge sentenced him to death, calling his crimes monstrous. The trial offered some closure, but to the families the pain would always remain, never to see their loved ones again, never to hear their laughter or hold them close. Justice was served, but it had come too little, too late for so many. The conviction was a victory, yet bittersweet. To the families, it underlined how much time was lost, how many lives could have been saved if the system had acted sooner. It was a moment to mourn as much as it was a moment to heal. The grim sleeper's reign of terror has come to an end, but the story of him has left an indelible mark, a reminder of how survivors like Anitria Washington have survived and how justice is needed for those no longer able to speak. In the end, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was unmasked, not by his guile, but by the doggedness of those who never allowed his victims to be forgotten. As much as South Central may have borne the weight of his darkness, it did bear the light of redemption. The story of South Central's is one of tragedy and triumph in one. It is a story of a community that refused to be silenced, of families fighting for their loved ones, and of a justice system which, belatedly perhaps, had answers. It is a story that reminds all to be vigilant, have compassion, and never forget the humanity that lies behind each statistic.